In the autumn of 1888, the harbor at Greyhaven Point, a modest trading port along the northern Atlantic coast, was already settling into its seasonal quiet. The fishing fleets had begun returning earlier each evening. The wind carried the constant smell of brine and tarred rope. On most mornings, fog drifted low across the water, thinning only after the sun reached its highest point. By all accounts, Greyhaven was unremarkable. It appeared in shipping registers as a secondary stop, useful, reliable, and rarely noteworthy. Yet, in late October, several harbor workers began recording observations that would later draw quiet attention from regional papers and maritime inspectors. The men involved were not sailors chasing rumors and customs clerks whose daily work depended on precise measurements of water depth and dock clearance. Among them was Samuel Rowe, a senior wharf supervisor, age 52, who had worked the harbor since boyhood. Another was Arthur Bell, keeper of the tide gauge, installed near Pier 3, responsible for logging daily fluctuations for the Port Authority. Their notebooks, later referenced in official correspondence, formed the earliest written record of what occurred. At first, nothing appeared extraordinary. The week began with calm seas and stable barometric readings. Local weather bulletins from nearby coastal stations reported no incoming storms. Wind direction remained steady. Bell noted the reading in the margin, writing only above projection. No wind surge observed. By mid-morning, other workers noticed small irregularities. A coal barge, moored overnight, sat closer to the upper cleats than usual. Wooden steps leading from pier to dipped lower into the water. A rope ladder, typically kept dry at its top rung, brushed the surface when moved by passing wakes. Tides, he reminded them, were not perfectly predictable. Local currents, offshore pressure systems, or distant storms could alter levels slightly without visible warning. Nets were repaired. No docks were submerged. There was no panic. But by evening, as lanterns were lit along the pier rails, a second discrepancy appeared. The outgoing tide did not recede, as far as expected. Each reading showed the same result. The waterline remained unusually high, despite the ebb cycle. He later wrote in his personal journal, a small leather-bound notebook now held in a regional archive. It was not surging. Not violently, not suddenly, but enough to be noticed by those who measured the sea for a living, and the following morning would make it impossible to ignore. The harbor water remained unnaturally smooth, reflecting the dock pilings in clear vertical lines. To casual eyes, nothing appeared out of place. But Arthur Bell reached the tide gauge before most of the workers arrived. He carried the previous day's ledger with him, intending only to confirm that the anomaly had corrected itself overnight. It had not. At 5:48 a.m., Bell recorded a level nearly 9 inches higher than the predicted morning low tide. The figure exceeded the prior day's deviation. He checked the gauge hardware for obstructions. Barnacle buildup was minimal. The float chamber showed no signs of sticking. The markings were intact. He wrote another note in the margin. Consistent rise. No weather cause observed. By the time the dock crews gathered, the effect was becoming visible. A fishing trawler that normally rested with a slight list at low tide now floated evenly, its hull brushing closer to the pier bumpers. Mooring ropes required adjustment. At mid-morning, Rowe ordered a manual depth check using weighted line at 3 points along the harbor edge. The results matched the gauge. The harbormaster contacted a coastal weather office by telegraph. The reply arrived shortly after noon. No storms were reported offshore. No abnormal pressure systems had been detected. Wind readings across the region remained low and stable. No tidal surge warnings had been issued. The men gathered near Pier 3, speaking quietly. Some suggested groundwater runoff from inland rain, though no heavy rain had fallen. Others mentioned distant seismic movement along the continental shelf, though no tremors had been recorded locally. By early afternoon, the harbor's outgoing tide again failed to retreat properly. The waterline held, not rising quickly, not falling, simply lingering at a level that should not have persisted. Rowe documented the condition in the official harbor log, marking it as unusual static behavior during EB. It was the first formal acknowledgement that something beyond routine variation might be occurring. Several captains delayed departures that evening. Shops stayed open. The post office continued deliveries. Church bells rang at dusk. No sirens sounded. No official warnings were posted, but among the harbor workers, unease had settled. Bell later described the sensation as waiting for something that had not yet arrived. As night fell, the water reflected the stars with unusual clarity. There was no chop, no ripple from passing current. Even the usual harbor sounds, creaking ropes, soft slaps against hulls, seemed subdued. Near midnight, a watchman on Pier 1 reported that the water had risen slightly again by only a few inches over the course of 2 hours. There was no tide change scheduled for that time. The report was written down, and for the first time, the men began to consider that what they were observing might not be temporary. Something within the harbor was changing its behavior. Slowly, quietly, and without any visible cause. By the morning of October 23rd, the harbor no longer behaved according to its charts. Bell reached the tide station before sunrise, lantern in hand. It had accumulated gradually across the previous 48 hours. Several lower dock platforms sat partially submerged. Wooden planks near the outer pier absorbed water and darkened. Storage crates stacked close to the edge were moved inland as a precaution. The harbor had never exhibited a sustained elevation without corresponding weather activity. Both replies confirmed normal conditions. No offshore disturbance, no unusual swell, no seismic notice. It pressed inward with a steady patience, lifting moored vessels slightly higher with each passing hour. By early afternoon, fishermen reported that nearshore nets were floating at depths typically seen only during peak tide. One crew returning from a short outing stated that the water felt heavier, though no scientific explanation accompanied the remark. Seagulls gather less frequently along the piers. Smaller fish, usually visible near the surface, were absent. Even the seals that often lingered beyond the breakwater were not seen that day. Shortly before dusk, the water rose again slowly enough that only continuous observation made it noticeable. Bell stood beside the gauge for nearly an hour, marking the incremental movement with chalk on the wooden housing. The surface crept upward by fractions of an inch, steady and uninterrupted. There was still no wind, no incoming tide, no storm pressure, just upward motion. The harbor master finally ordered a temporary suspension of nighttime unloading. Lantern patrols were increased along the piers to monitor changes after dark. That evening, the men did not leave the harbor quickly. Instead, the surface remained unnaturally calm, reflecting dock lights with a clarity that made the gradual rise more noticeable. No alarms were sounded. No official emergency was declared. What had begun as a discrepancy in a ledger was now visible to anyone who worked the piers. The harbor was changing, and it was doing so without any sign that it intended to stop. The morning of October 24th arrived under heavy fog. The outlines of ships and pier posts emerging only in fragments as the mist thinned and thickened with the shifting air. By sunrise, the water had reached a level normally associated with the highest spring tides. Arthur Bell's first reading showed the gauge exceeding its standard upper reference mark. He was forced to note the measurement on the wooden frame itself, marking a pencil line above the brass scale. Rowe arrived shortly afterward and stood silently beside him. Neither spoke at first. The waterline now brushed the lower edges of warehouse steps. Several dock planks creaked softly under pressure as they absorbed moisture from below. A rowboat tied near Pier 2 knocked gently against its mooring posts, floating higher than its rope adjustments allowed. At 8:40 a.m., the harbor master issued the first formal operational halt. All incoming vessels were ordered to remain offshore. Outgoing ships were instructed not to depart. Cargo operations ceased entirely. Workers were told to move remaining goods away from the pier edges. This decision was not based on flooding. None had yet occurred, but on uncertainty. The harbor no longer followed known rules. Shortly before midday, the most troubling observation was made. Bell and two assistants stood near the gauge during what should have been the peak plateau of the tide cycle. Instead of stabilizing, the water continued rising, slowly, steadily, without interruption. Bell later testified in a written statement that he watched the water climb nearly half an inch in less than 20 minutes. There was no accompanying swell, no surge, no disturbance of surface patterns. It was as if the harbor basin itself were being lifted. Word spread quickly along the docks. Workers gathered at elevated points along the piers. Some climbed warehouse steps for a clearer view. Others stood on crates and railings, watching the water creep across familiar markers, stains on wood, rust lines on iron, old tide scars etched into stone. By early afternoon, seawater began spilling onto the lowest dock sections near the outer harbor wall. Not violently, not in waves. It pooled quietly, seeping across planks and settling in shallow, reflective sheets. Several men stepped back instinctively. A small group of townspeople, drawn by rumors, gathered at the edge of the harbor road. Only the persistent, quiet realization that the sea was advancing without invitation or explanation. By late afternoon, Rowe ordered all remaining workers off the lowest piers. Lanterns were positioned along higher walkways to monitor the water's edge through the evening. Bell stayed behind longer than instructed. He remained beside the gauge, recording each incremental rise until the markings reached the very top of the measuring board. There was nowhere left to write. As darkness fell, the harbor lights reflected across a broader surface than anyone in Greyhaven could remember seeing. The water had not yet taken the town, but it had taken the docks, and it showed no sign of retreat. Lantern patrols moved slowly along the higher piers, their reflections trembling faintly across the expanded surface of the harbor. The water no longer advanced in visible increments, but it did not withdraw either. It held its position with a quiet persistence. The shoreline, the extent of the change became fully apparent. Lower dock platforms were submerged entirely. Mooring posts stood half hidden beneath the surface. Several small fishing sheds near the outer pier had taken on moisture through their foundations. Salt water pooled beneath raised floors. Tools left overnight showed the first signs of corrosion by morning. The harbor master ordered a full closure of the port. No cargo was to be loaded or unloaded. No vessels were permitted to dock. A temporary anchorage zone was established farther offshore for ships already waiting. They gathered tide charts, gauge logs, weather bulletins, and handwritten journals. Everything was copied carefully. Discrepancies were underlined. None were given with confidence. The official response remained restrained. Shop owners near the waterfront moved goods to higher shelves. Residents living closest to the shore placed sandbags near doorways. That afternoon, a regional maritime inspector arrived by rail. According to his brief report, and no evidence of false readings. As though different parts of the harbor responded at different rates, Bell recorded this irregular withdrawal with visible frustration in his notes. He wrote, "Movement inconsistent. No clear cycle restored." The harbor had crossed a boundary. It had behaved in a way none of the men could reconcile with their training or experience. And now, even as the water hesitated and shifted uncertainly, the question remained unanswered. What had forced the sea to rise when no tide had called it forward? The waterline receded slowly over several days, never dropping suddenly, never surging again. Steps became visible once more. Mooring posts stood dry at their upper markings. By the first week of November, shipping traffic resumed under cautious supervision. Officially, the incident was closed without formal explanation. The Harbor Authority filed a summary report describing the event as an unusual but temporary deviation in tidal behavior. No public statement drew attention beyond the region. Arthur Bell's gauge logs were archived. A brief article appeared in a regional maritime circular, mentioning Greyhaven's sustained high water anomaly, though it offered no interpretation. Bell's private journal ends abruptly 2 weeks after the event. Pattern not restored to former confidence. He never again made marginal corrections in his tide logs. Rowe, in later correspondence, avoided discussing the incident directly. When asked by a shipping inspector years later whether the harbor had experienced other irregularities, he reportedly replied only, "Not of that particular kind." Among the dockworkers, the event became something spoken of quietly, if at all. There were no dramatic only brief remarks exchanged between men who had stood together at the water's edge and watched the harbor behave in a way they could not name. In the decades that followed, Greyhaven Point continued its operations. Storms came and went. Tides followed their expected cycles. And yet, the harbor charts were subtly adjusted. New safety margins were added. Clearance recommendations were increased. Only scattered ledgers, archived correspondence, and fading newspaper print preserved the account. There was no storm, no earthquake, not with force, but with a calm persistence that left no answer behind. The harbor remains, the measurements remain, and the cause remains unrecorded.